Perhaps you have heard the quote before: those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. That was Benjamin Franklin, or at least attributed to. And today we are going to talk about this quote. This is AllMinucOne. My name is Bill, and if you like this kind of content, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell your friends, people. Help me grow. Help me help you by covering these things about history, economics, and philosophy. All right, let's get into it. A background on where this quote comes from. During the Pennsylvania Assembly, there was a reply to the governor, 11 November 1775, during the first years of the French and Indian War. Now, at the time, the Penns owned the majority of the land of Pennsylvania. They essentially owned all of the state of what we now call Pennsylvania. And it says, upon learning of Indian attacks at Penn's Creek and other places in the Susquehanna Valley, Governor Morris summoned the assembly for November 3rd, 1755. He urged them to pass a militia law and provide funds for defense, although he cautioned them not to waste your time in offering me such bills, as you must know, it is not in my power to contest or to consent to. And the reason why Governor Morris was saying this is because he essentially worked for the Penns, and it was not really his say in the end. So it says, in the same message, Morris reported that the Delawares and the Shawnees had defected to the French, assuming that ill treatment of those Indians by Pennsylvania must have been the reason they are now ravaging the frontier. Quaker leaders in the assembly secured approval of a message, November 5th, asking the governor to seek the causes of the dissatisfaction and do whatever is necessary to regain the friendship of the Indians. The same day, the assembly resolved that 60,000 pounds be granted for the king's use to be struck in paper bills of credit backed by the taxes on all estates in the province. Franklin and 5 others were appointed to prepare the bill pursuant to the resolve. It was brought in the next day and passed on November 8th. So essentially, it gets into here, the taxes that were going to be put on to raise this money were of the proprietors of the land, and that was the Penns. Now, if you don't know your history about William Penn or the Penns themselves, they were Quakers. They were seeking religious freedom, and the king had granted them the land. Pennsylvania simply means Penn's Woods. If you've ever been through the state of Pennsylvania or looked at a map, it is huge. So this brings me to this NPR article. This was written on March 2nd, 2015. Ben Franklin's famous liberty, safety quote lost its context in the 21st century. It says, Ben Franklin once said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. That quote often comes up in the context of a new technology that concerns about government surveillance. Benjamin White's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and editor of the Lawfare tells NPR Robert Siegel that it was originally meant to mean wasn't originally meant to mean what people think it means. So let's get down here to this little bit of interview. It says very simply, and I am paraphrasing here, but Ben Franklin essentially said at one point, those who would trade privacy for a bit of security deserve neither privacy nor security. Now, Mr. Anderson there is completely incorrect. That is not what Ben was saying at all. Mr. Segal replied, now Anderson did say he was paraphrasing, but a few of you wrote in anyway saying, hey, that's not the quote. So we're going to clear things up right now. Benjamin White's editor of the website Lawfare and senior fellow at the Brookings Institute joins us. So he said, what's the exact quotation? And White says the exact quotation, which is from a letter that Franklin is believed to have written on behalf of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. This is true. We don't know who wrote that letter, but Ben Franklin was so influential within Pennsylvania that it's believed that he wrote it. It also is, in some degree, stylistically, the way he would write. It says it reads, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. It said, what was the difference, or what was the content of this remark? He was writing about a tax dispute between Pennsylvania General Assembly and the family of the Penns. The proprietary family of Pennsylvania colony who ruled it from afar. And the legislator was trying to tax the Penn family lands to pay for frontier defense during the French and Indian War. And the Penn family kept instructing the governor to veto. Franklin felt that this was a great affront to the ability of the legislature to govern. And so he actually meant purchase a little temporary safety very literally. The Penn family was trying to give a lump sum of money in exchange for the General Assembly's acknowledgement that it did not have the authority to tax. So this was a dispute about who had power within the government. Was it the aristocracy, the Penns, or was it the Assembly? So he continues. It is a quotation that defends the authority of a legislature to govern in the interest of collective security. It means, in context, not quite the opposite of what it's almost always quoted as saying, but much closer to the opposite than the thing that people think it means. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, but we will get to an article here soon about that. One thing that should always be understood whenever analyzing anything anyone says is their disposition, their political and moral dispositions. White's is from the Brookings Institute. Now, they're not a crazy institute or anything, but they are very left-leaning. So, he says, well, you've said that it's used in the context of surveillance and technology, and it came up in my conversation. And Mr. Anderson, because he's part of what's called the Ben Franklin Privacy Caucus in the Virginia legislature. What do you make of the use of this quotation as a motto for something that really wasn't the sentiment Franklin had in mind? To which White's replies, you know, there are all of these quotations. Think of killing all the lawyers, right? From Shakespeare. Nobody really remembers what the character in question were saying at the time, and maybe it doesn't matter so much what Franklin was actually trying to say because the quotation means so much to us in terms of the tension between government power and individual liberties. But I do think it is worth remembering that what he said was actually trying to say because the actual context is much more sensitive to the problems of real governance than the flip quotation's use is often. And Franklin was dealing with a genuine security emergency. There were raids on these frontier towns, and he regarded the ability of the community to defend itself as an essential liberty that it would be contemptible to trade. So I don't really have a problem with the people misusing the quotation, but I also think it's worth remembering what it was really about. So from there, we are going to look at this Techcrunch article. Now, this one is from around the same time. Well, actually, this was about a year prior to the NPR article, I believe. Let me check on that real quick. Yeah, NPR was March 2015, and this one was February, Valentine's Day of 2014. So, again, NPR, if you were not aware, is left-leaning. Now, you may think NPR is the public broadcasting network. Why would it be left-leaning? Well, the majority of the government is left-leaning. Even the Republicans who are establish and empower, the majority of them are actually left-leaning. So this says liberty versus security. One of the American favorite liberal phrases has been sent through the political spin machine and polished into a Frankenstein of sorts, thus rendering it inaccurate and far from its original intent. You might have heard that America's founding father, Benjamin Franklin, said something like, "Those who give up liberty for security deserve neither." That'd be a good summation, I would say. The quote has been the siren song of anti-war protesters, and most recently, the banner for masses online protest against the NSA surveillance program. For instance, there was Reddit's front page several days ago, which, like, who cares, right? At the Brookings Institute, Benjamin White observed the very few people who quote these words, however, have any idea where they come from or what Franklin was saying when he wrote them. Despite its many, many variations, this is the actual quote. "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." According to White's, the words appear in a letter widely presumed to be written by Franklin in 1755 on behalf of the Pennsylvania Assembly to the colonial governor. The letter was a salvo in a power struggle between the governor and the Assembly over funding for security on the frontier, one in which the Assembly wished to tax the lands of the Penn family, he explains. This, of course, being one of the many problems why a group of men eventually decided to start their own revolution. Most people don't know that the Revolutionary War had something like a 10-year lead up right after the French and Indian War. The letter wasn't about liberty, but about taxes and the ability to raise money for defense against French and Indian attacks. The governor kept vetoing the Assembly's efforts at the behest of the family which had appointed them. Indeed, if you look at the text surrounding the famous quote, it's pretty clear about money. Our assemblies have, of late, had so many supply bills, and of such different kinds, rejected on various pretenses, wrote Franklin. There's not much on liberty as we understand the concept in the entire letter, and this isn't true. However, we will get to that. How did it get butchered? To Google engrams, and I just want to make a note here what engrams are in case you don't know. And essentially, that is the field of computational linguistics and probability. An engram is a contagious sequence of n items from a given sample of text or speech. So that's technobabble. If you're into that stuff, you can look that up, but not to be confused with engrams from diuretics, Scientology, or engrams from neuropsychology. All right, back to the text. So essentially, he is analyzing the words here through Google, and you can see Franklin's quote did not mean much for 150 years after it was uttered, then had a solid and steady uptick around the latter half of the 20th century. When fear of Big Brother beginning to mount, the top chart represents the frequency of the quote in books from 1750 present to the bottom from 1950. So we can look at this real quick. In a few 19th century books, the quote does appear in it. It doesn't appear to be taken out of context, such as in 1865's epic retelling of the life of Joseph Warren, where it is quoted in full with delicious servings of content. But in 19th century, authors weren't always so committed to fidelity of the quote itself. In 1851, in A History of All Nations, the author wrote it in more of a modern form. They who can give up liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century did the butchering for ideological purposes begin. For instance, it was taken out of context in the book that is one of the closest things libertarians have to a Bible, Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Now, that's absurd. Having been ensconced in libertarian ideas for over 15 years, I can tell you, no libertarian thinks the Road to Serfdom is a Bible. Perhaps, maybe, Murray Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty, or perhaps Ludwig von Mises's giant treatise. This book is about this thick. I consider bringing here to show you, but I didn't. Is a lot of that's what they take their thoughts from. There's also, of course, all of the writers from the Enlightenment that were classical liberals, because that's all libertarian is. And I mean little L, not big L, as they like to make the distinction. But that has many authors. Locke, Montesquieu, I've quoted to you before, Bastiat. There are numerous others. Edmund Burke, who was the father of the classical liberal conservative tradition, and so forth. So this is some guy saying nonsense, in my opinion. But he says, where Franklin's quote concludes a chapter on the magnificence of free markets. Well, the markets were pretty free back then, but I mean, Hayek may have used that. I read that book some odd years ago. I don't actually own a copy, but it is what it is, man. The banner anti-security quotes continue throughout the century in government reports on limited government and early apocalyptic warnings about the security state. Well, I mean, come on, guys. Like, do you really want to be surveilled all the time? This is part of what I was talking about with the cyberpunk the other day, with the police state and losing your humanity. Like, do you really need to be watched like you're a child? Do you like slavery? Misquoting folks isn't new. It arises from the need to push an idea rather than investigate the truth. It's no shocker, then, that the campaigns and ideological works have been the culprits of butchering Franklin's words. There's even an academic term for this strategy, and that is called contextotomy, which, in brief, is essentially quoting something out of context. So that's about it for that article. That makes me want to bring in an article of Reason from Reason magazine. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Reasons anymore for various reasons. I'm going to say Reason one more time because that sounds really good over and over again, apparently. But they do have some good stuff from time to time again, and they definitely produce a lot of good stuff on economics that can change your perspective because they look at the issues that the unintended consequences of certain economic effects that people often don't think about. This article is titled Liberty, Safety, and Benjamin Franklin. Yesterday, oh, by the way, this was from November 11th, 2014. Yesterday, I saw again an argument that used Benjamin Franklin's famous quote, those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And this reminded how often the quote is misused to generally condemn liberty for safety trade-offs, something I wrote about back in 2002, in the earliest days of this blog. First, note how important the qualifiers are: essential liberty, a little safety, and temporary at that. Sure, once you put it away, but who but a fool would give up something essential to get a little temporary something else? Indeed, once we label something essential, it itself is an assertion that we shouldn't be giving it up, at least unless we get something even more essential in exchange. One can just as well say. So, after all, if the safety is really the essential, how could we reasonably give it up just to get a little temporary something else, even something as important as liberty? Indeed, sensible government, including the government that Benjamin Franklin helped build, necessarily involves constant trade-offs of liberty and safety. The Fourth Amendment bars unreasonable search and seizures and requires probable cause for warrants. But that means that it allows reasonable search and seizures and allows warrants, even to search your house and papers when there is probable cause. So, right, we're not talking about anarchism. There are small trade-offs. the issue with the security state, the police state, is that we're not giving small trade-offs anymore. What we're getting is we're getting this top-down authoritarian control versus something that helps protect all of society. And you can make an argument against the police state and the surveillance state, the NSA, and all that stuff. But I do not think that the founding fathers would agree. They didn't have spy agencies themselves, and with very good reasons. Spies were used during war, and they did not believe in having standing armies. If we wanted maximum liberty, we could ban all searches and seizures, period. But we realized that the consequence would be an unacceptable loss of safety. You couldn't search someone's home for a dead body or for a murder weapon, and indeed a loss of liberty in the sense that criminals undermine our liberty. Exactly. That's in fact what is going on today in our society, is that there are criminal elements who wish to bring about a communist utopia in the United States, and they are undermining our liberty. And the people that would like to undermine our liberty on top, who are in charge, really, they appreciate what's going on, because they know that let's say if they get back control of things, that they will have gained more power because people will have asked them for that power. They're playing a very, very dangerous gamble. They're gambling to get the Republicans out of office, and especially Donald Trump, because Donald Trump does not go along with the globalist mission. Anyways, so we trade off some non-essential liberty, at least Franklin would likely have viewed it as non-essential, in order to get a considerable amount of long-term safety, which may even include a different sort of liberty. The list could go on. Franklin famously argued for enforcing libel law as a means of reasonably retaining liberty in order to protect reputation and perhaps to prevent violence. And we see this too now. Libel and slander are very rarely prosecuted against, let's say, journalists or people public speaking. But if that happened more often, then we might have more a higher level of truth in society amongst the media. And of course, many people hear the rhetoric of certain others that so-and-so is evil or so-and-so is a horrible person, and they just believe it because they're not thinking individuated beings. They're not developed beings. They just go on their emotions. And so with that, they act, and violence does happen. For instance, a certain Bernie Sanders supporter shot up a small baseball game and hurt some congressmen. That happened several years ago. I don't remember the names off the top of my head, but back to the text here. The jury is seen as a protector of liberty, but it's part of a criminal justice system that necessarily threatens to take away people's life, liberty, or property in order to make society safe from criminals, always with the risk that this action will inadvertently punish the innocent or can be corrupted in doing so. Franklin was a prominent supporter of the U.S. Constitution, but it clearly gave the federal government a great deal of power that would or could be used to restrain liberty in some measure. The power to regulate, the power to tax, the power to raise armies, and more. So there's an important thing here. We give up a little bit of liberty, because the government is our extension of force. Instead of us going out in mobs, instead of us doing the force ourselves, it's the one thing we concede that the government does for us. One of the reasons why we concede that is because it's supposed to be unbiased, but it isn't necessarily if it becomes political, if it becomes tribal, if it becomes factional. However, the risk of criminal elements to liberty is huge. We know this. We know this from other countries that have warlords. We know this in areas like New York City, where the mafia ruled for so long. I just saw on Netflix the other day that they had a documentary series on how essentially the mafia was terrorizing New York City and how horrible that criminal element was. We know the same thing happened within Chicago later on during the 20th century. Let's see here. Oh, the other thing was that the power to regulate taxes and that the federal government would have more power. This is in comparison to the Articles of Confederation. And he will get into all that. You can read this article if you would like. I'm going to jump down here a little bit further. Let's see. Then Franklin famously repeated the words right before the Revolution as a defense of the colonies' right not to have their charters and laws altered by Parliament again. We're talking about liberty in the sense of communal self-government, not individual liberty. And that's what I kind of wanted to get down to. The idea that the government represents the individual can only happen with self-government. We don't have a lot of self-government anymore because we don't have people involved in our government anymore. So the context that this author is giving, and I will link all of these links in the description, versus the other two articles, is that Franklin himself understood what the government was used for. It was to organize the community in such a way to protect them. The other two authors, they don't quite get on that. They don't quite see that. So it says, and yet a dozen years later, there was Franklin and the Constitutional Convention signing and apparently fully endorsing the Constitution, which sharply increased the power of the federal government as compared to its power under the Articles of Confederation. And that's a quick thing I want to make a note of. If you don't think about these things, the federal government means federation government, much like confederation. It is a union, much like the European Union was. It's literally the same thing. And we have to pay attention to this because it was a dangerous thing for them to attempt. They thought that the Constitution would keep the federal power in check to only be able to raise armies and taxes and squash insurrections and to keep the states from fighting amongst each other. They were right only in the sense that I don't think they believed that men would concede their rights and allow the federal government to abandon the Constitution almost completely as they do today. Let's see. Why I take it that Franklin thought, as I suggested at the outset, that it is fine to renounce some liberty so long as it is not essential liberty to attain a large measure of long-term safety rather than a little temporary safety. Indeed, if you step back a bit, a big part of Franklin's life as a pragmatic politician, a big part of all sound politics in a country that aspires to liberty, was the inevitable exercise of careful judgment about which restraints on liberty are justified by the desire for more safety and which are not. Indeed, even much libertarian legal and political thinking is about how to exercise such careful judgment. And this really gets to the point of everything, right? It gets to the point that you need to be very pragmatic in thinking about this and slow to change the law. When the Congress passes new legislation that comes in overnight and bills out of nowhere that you haven't even read yet, like the Patriot Act or the, as we call it, Obamacare. And then you have people like Nancy Pelosi saying, well, you have to pass it in order to be able to know what's in it. Well, obviously that's absurd. But people don't think, and, they just pick their team. And that's really what politics are. I used to have a joke that, or I still do, let's say that when people ask me if I'm in the sports, I'm like, not really, other than politics, because it's true. It's true. That's what politics are. And at least in the modern sense in America, they're just team sports. And I'm not actually rooting for either team. I root for one team more often than the other, but I'm not really rooting for either team. And of course, I watched the UFC as well, so that's not the only sport that I watch, but primarily politics. And the reason why I call it a sport is because it's all posturing. It's all nonsense. It's all people who are happy with their power, and they want prestige, and they like the affluence they have, and they're just not accountable to Americans. So let's go to the actual text. Now, this text is about 1,000 words, I believe, but I'm just going to read the paragraph in which that line applies. It says, in fine, we have the most sensible concern for the poor distressed inhabitants of the frontiers. We have taken every step in our power, consistently with the rights of the free men of Pennsylvania, for their relief, and we have reason to believe that in the midst of their distress, they themselves do not wish us to go farther. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety, such as it were inclined to defend themselves, but unable to purchase arms and ammunitions, have, as we are informed, been supplied with both, as far as arms could be procured out of the moneys given by the last assembly for the king's use, and the large supply of money offered by this bill might enable the governor to do everything else that should be judged necessary for their further security, if he shall think fit to accept it, whether he could, as he supposes. If his hands had been properly strengthened, have put the province into such a posture of defense as might have prevented the present mischiefs, seems to us uncertain. Since late experience in our neighboring colony of Virginia, we have had every advantage for that purpose that could be desired, shows clearly that it is next to impossible to guard effectually an extended frontier settled by a scattered single families at 2 or 3 miles distances. Excuse me, folks. Settled by scattered single families at 2 or 3 miles distances, so as to secure them from the insidious attacks of small parties of skulking marauders. But this much is certain, that by refusing our bill from time to time, by which great sums were seasonably offered, he has rejected all the strength that money could afford him. And if his hands were still weak or unable, he ought only to blame himself, or those who have tied them. And those who have tied them would have been the pens. Now, in this context, is this talking about a police state or raising armies or any of that sort? No. Franklin is saying that the people needed armaments to help protect themselves at the time, or a militia potentially to be there. And the reason why was because of their scattered distance. Because if the Indian tribes at the time or the French wanted to come and attack those people on their farms, there was no one else there but their families. And they knew that these people alone would be hurt. Is this the same kind of thing that justifies a mass surveillance state? No. So in looking at this, we have to understand the full context of it. And what what Franklin understood was that he needed to rebuke the governor in order to get monies, in order to help these people out on that frontier. Now, if you look at where, Penn's Creek? If you look at where that's at on the map, you will find that it is not that far out. It's not that far away from a lot of modern East Coast cities like Philadelphia. It's actually up near the state college, Penn State. So we're not talking about way out in the west, and we're not even talking about the western edge, almost Ohio of Pennsylvania. We're talking about very close and nearby to where they were at. So again, within this context, the understanding needs to be not a modern one, but one of the day. Is the quote valid? Yes. Is the quote valid in the way people use it? Potentially. is the quote essentially saying that the government has the power to do anything it wants to secure people's liberties? Not necessarily, but the government does have that power, and that is their primary purpose. And Franklin understood this all too well. So, with all that, thank you all for watching and listening. This has been AllMinucOne. Please like, share, and subscribe if you've stayed with me this long, and be well.